Are talking about the Critical Raw Materials Act, something that is very much at the forefront of EU policy at the moment. We'll be asking the question, what are the opportunities for European industry and technology providers? Now, of course, we've heard so much in recent months about digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy, but let us not forget there is no digital without those critical raw materials. So we're going to talk about that. We'll be looking at strengthening global supply chains. We know that there has been disruption in recent years, expanding free trade agreements, something that is increasingly important during these current economic times, and also a way to combat unfair trade practices. All things that have exercised the minds of our speakers today, because we have joining us, I am very pleased to say, from the Unit for Energy Intensive Critical Raw Materials in DG GROW in the European Commission, Deputy Head of Unit, Madalina Ivanica. Thank you very much for joining us. We also have from the ITRE Committee in the European Parliament, Henrike Hahn, MEP. Diego Francesco Marin is the Policy Officer for Raw Materials and Resource Justice at the European Environmental Bureau. So thank you very much for joining us as well. Georg Rikeles is the Associate Director at the European Policy Centre, bringing in that policy side. And last but by no means least, representing hands on the ground, we have Ansgar Thule, President and Managing Director of Komatsu Germany, which is a mining company. If you're not familiar with it, we will hear a little bit more about that in due course. But first, let me give over the floor to the Commission first. Madalina, to you. Tell us a bit about the thinking behind the CRMA and what's gone into getting us to where we are today.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for organizing this event on a very strategic subject, such as the critical raw materials. Of course, the timing couldn't have been better, as the Commission just adopted on the 16th of March, the Critical Raw Materials Act. The Act marks a turning point for Europe as we work towards a determined, resilient and responsible industrial policy that will ensure a stable, competitive and sustainable supply of critical raw material. As you already mentioned, critical raw materials are essential for Europe to succeed in the green and digital transition, but they are also essential elements for the defense and aerospace applications needed in a constantly renewed
full round of openings.
Geopolitical context. Yes, you mentioned the regulation. The critical raw material regulation builds or actually on the strengths of the European market and the external partnerships that the EU is developing. And the main aims are to increase our resilience and to strengthen our open strategic autonomy. That's already mentioned by you. And how we are going to do that? The Act looks at ways and proposes measures to strengthen all the stages of the European critical raw material value chain. We propose provisions to improve the EU capacity to monitor and mitigate the risk of disruptions to critical raw material supply. We also have a very strong pillar looking at how to improve critical raw material circularity and sustainability. And of course, we need to continue working with the external parties and third countries in order to diversify the EU critical raw material imports in order to reduce the strategic dependencies. Of course, I'm glad today throughout our debate to provide more details about the content and provisions of the Act. So I give now the floor back to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Let's turn then to our parliamentary representative, Henrike. What do you like most and what do you maybe like least about the Critical Raw Materials Act?
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion already. And I think the EU Critical Raw Materials Act is part of the regulatory pillar of the Green Deal industrial plan, as well as in reaction to the US IRA. So we need a sustainable, competitive industry in Europe, including a green raw material strategy. And correspondingly, we Greens, EFA, welcome a lot of important provisions of the CRMA. In particular, we welcome the provisions towards a circularity of all critical raw materials in our economy. For instance, for the increase of the collection and treatment of critical raw materials, rich waste and products, or the increase of technological maturity of recycling and promotion of materials efficiency and substitution strategies. So imposing an assessment of the potential recovery of CRM from extractive waste is also a very positive step in the right direction to further recognize the tremendous potential of circularity. And to some extent, provisions aiming at raising the awareness of large companies on their exposure and potential risk of supply are, of course, very much welcome. So, however, the proposal contains as well disappointing and even problematic aspects as well. First of all, there's a lack of consideration for the potential of demand-side actions to curb the future demand, whereas all the overarching targets proposed, like extraction, processing, recycling, would be more easily reached by decreasing the material footprint. And we can be also much more ambitious with regard to the benchmarks as proposed by the Commission. Therefore, in our green amendments I submitted just today, we have proposed a recycling benchmark designed towards an objective of circular economy according to the amount of strategic raw materials available to be recycled, see present in waste, instead of as a comparison to the annual consumption, to set a benchmark of recycling capacity in the Union corresponding to 70% of the amount of strategic raw materials present in waste. So a benchmark for self-sufficiency, in my view, instead of extraction, is important. And here we are not changing the figure of 10% to be precise, but we also include in our amendments a slightly reinforced objective of diversification of supply chains by intending to diversify EU imports as long as it's more concentrated than the global average. And finally, we also reinforce provisions and language around local and affected communities, in particular indigenous communities, and about involvement of communities and so on. So lots of important points I mentioned already. So it's a good step in the right direction, but we can make it better.
Thank you very much. We will come on to some of those figures indeed, and the benchmarks that have been set out. Diego, let me turn to you. I guess you have some of the similar concerns coming from the Environmental Bureau, but give us your overall impressions first of the CRMA as proposed.
Thank you very much for having me here as well today. Indeed, as MEP Enrica Hahn was mentioning, there is some positives as well as some negatives. Maybe on the positive side, I'll speak a little bit about, for example, what has not been yet mentioned is the importance of mining waste, the mining waste potential. So basically, this is a point that we have been pushing for a little bit. And actually, with some of our colleagues at Catapa, for example, an NGO that was involved in this Horizon project, the importance of mining waste really came about, I think, in the last 8 years, for example. And through that, there's been a lot of interesting developments on that area. For example, LKAB at the moment has a project coming up. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. But there's a lot of potential on that. And of course, data information for that will be necessary. So maybe to get a little bit more on the more specific sides, it's just really important to say that the EU is no longer material blind. I think that there is a high recognition now of what it is needed to do to get to the energy transition. However, of course, this really depends on how these targets are going to be set up. They're going to be discussed, whether these targets are unambitious in some areas, for example, in the recycling area. 15% is, of course, movement forward. But the lack of language on, for example, recycling content is not there. And of course, it's good to have recycling targets. But of course, if you don't have recycling content targets, you really uptick in the circular economy will have its limits. Some of the concerns also rely on the, and I'm very glad that Enrica Hahn mentioned this, is of course on the impact that this will have on local communities, particularly on indigenous communities around the world. It is generally understood that all of these projects will impact actually these communities, indigenous communities around the world. So the lack of language on that is clearly a concern for us. Additionally, for that related to it is the over-reliance on certification schemes, of course, and audits. So this is, of course, a red flag. I know in the ITRA draft, for example, this language is even reinforced even more. But anyway, I'm sure that we will be able to talk more about it. Overall, just to say that the EU has an opportunity really with the Critical Raw Materials Act to enhance not only sustainability of these raw materials, but also increase self-reliance, and of course have the international angle, which is extremely important, on creating a different development model with the global south that is yet to be seen. But again, on the negative side, still questions remain, and I'm afraid that if we don't get this right, the impacts and the ramifications of the Critical Raw Materials Act could actually become worse even than the problems that we're trying to solve.
Well, let's try and focus on some of those problem-solving angles over the next hour or so. And I'm sure Ansgar will come back to follow up on some of your points regarding mining. But Georg, let me come to you. Your first impressions of the Act, give us an overall view before we get into the detail.
Thank you, Jennifer, and a pleasure to be here for this debate. Well, what I like the most about this, I mean, I'm picking up a word used by Madalena. She spoke about the turning point for Europe. I think what's really important here is that we are at a turning point in the way Europe is looking at the international environment. We're understanding that we're facing brutal geopolitics, and also that the international economic environment is changing and about to change quite drastically. So in a sense, Europe is no longer believing blindly in free trade, open markets, market-neutral policies. Of course, that would be the first best, but it's not the reality we are facing and the conditions we have to operate in. So Europe is upping its game, looking into dependencies, into the strategic competition, looking for what open strategic autonomy means, area by area. And of course, this is an example. And when it comes to critical raw materials, I think it's very clear. China is strategically prepared for the mineral economy that is coming. China is strategically prepared for the green transition, for the net zero age. Europe is not. So overall, what I find very positive is that we now have a Commission Act that says, okay, we need to think about mining in Europe, rather than having this logic simply of not in my backyard, and these problems will be or these resources will come from elsewhere. In the past, politicians have avoided trade-offs. Now there's a sense of there's a willingness to face them. What I like the least about it, or sort of the point we need to work on, is that whether we're talking about the Net Zero Industry Act or the Green Deal Industrial Plan or now the Critical Raw Materials Act, essentially what we're talking about, what's coming out of the Commission, is all rather declaratory when you have these percentage figures, for instance. So I think we must be very honest that as Europe, we are pretty much where China was 15, 20 years ago. China's plans for clean tech, be it hydrogen, batteries, wind, solar, or its strategies for raw materials, they developed that in their 11th or 12th five-year plans. That's 15, 20 years ago. So we have to be very conscious now of the road we have to travel to be credible in all of this. Think really hard about how we reach all these objectives. And I think there's a lot of things to work on that also goes obviously beyond what's in the Raw Material Act.
Thank you. As you say, a lot of ground to cover. Ansgar, let me turn to you. Tell us a little bit as well about Komatsu and how you're interacting with the Critical Raw Materials Act.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the invitation, for having me here. Generally speaking, I think Komatsu Germany, but also Komatsu, of course, worldwide, welcomes very much this initiative from the EU. The EU has recognized for quite some time the importance of this topic and have put forward several initiatives. However, this proposal now marks, especially when it comes to pace, a significant change in this regard. I think not only Komatsu, but also the entire European machinery and equipment industry is really keen to play an essential role here in this initiative, and will be one of the key enablers in the environmentally friendly extraction and recycling of raw material in the EU and worldwide. In the case of a sustainable implementation of the CRMA, the EU can certainly rely on the know-how and the advanced technology of the European machinery industry. Also, and this is also important when it comes to a fair partnership in projects in third countries, probably abroad the EU boundaries. Central positive aspect of the CRMA is certainly securing the supply of raw material as an original and important corporate responsibility, first of all. The companies must decide by themselves which strategies and methods they want to secure to save the supply of raw materials. However, and this is quite evident, especially in the last years, supply of raw material has very much a geopolitical component, which cannot be addressed by the individual business units alone. And thus public authorities and national governments and the EU have to play a role to shape the framework for access to raw materials. And this act certainly serves as an important step. It's also worthwhile to mention, it was already done now 2 times before by the predecessors, that mining is now explicitly mentioned as one of the key technologies to achieve the Green Deals and our targets, environmental targets in this. And the Act proposed for this nowadays, it sets certain targets for the first time, so far as I know, for the supply of strategic and critical raw materials through EU sources. And this also entails a fair split between primary and secondary materials and actions to scale it up properly. However, timing appears to be very crucial as the targets are set for 2030. 30 is just leaving Europe just with 7 years to achieve them. So in other words, in the short term, the contribution of additional mining capacity in Europe is unlikely to happen. And this is largely due to the very long-lasting permitting processes. Today, we are talking here about easily a time span of 10 to 15 years and the difficulty to attract private investment. In Portugal and the area, we have just recently seen that public acceptance is very low and thus hindering the mining projects. This is something that also needs to be addressed by the policymakers and needs to be brought back in the public awareness. So thus, to achieve the target, the EU companies have to enter into international cooperations on existing projected mines. And to enable this, European foreign investment policy, including FTAs, export credits, financing guarantees, and so on, to facilitate private investment is needed. On these and the means to support this, further clarification is most likely needed. That's it from my side.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think we've covered a lot there of the kind of preparatory statements, as it were, to set out where everyone's position is. Let me bring your audience attention to the fact that you can ask questions of our panelists as well. Simply scan the QR code that you see there on your screen, or you can go to slido.com on your browser or on your phone and use the hashtag CRMA. That's open from now, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can during our discussion. Let me come back to you, Diego. Tell us a bit more about, you mentioned that project. What would you like to say about that, the LKB project? Tell us what direction you want to see us going in for this discussion.
When you said, So basically, sorry, I misheard you. So at the moment right now, the projections are based on market demand by 2030. We know that 60% of this demand, for example, 50 to 60, is coming from the mobility sector, mainly private vehicle use. So the concern of that is that we basically dig up as many holes as we can for private vehicle use, right? And then the issue is, of course, that this can come at the competition of other technologies that are actually needed for the energy transition, such as solar and wind, or even in other technologies, net zero industries, of course. So this is the kind of thing that we need to do. Are we doing enough in terms of the circular economy? And do we know enough about what is potentially able to be extracted, right? I think this is really key. So in this sense, under this sphere, the mining waste becomes a really interesting opportunity for businesses, of course, to not only extract this material, but also from a environmental perspective, because a lot of this waste is just sitting there. It's not doing anything. It's not providing an environmental benefit nor an economic benefit. So, but the reasoning behind this also, it is extremely energy intensive. I think LKB is one of the leading companies there who says that by 2027, their project in the north of Sweden would be able to take off. And basically through 2 mines, they will be able to extract around 30% of the rare earth minerals by 2030. and meet 5 times the demand of phosphorus for Sweden. So this is really interesting, but the issue that I say is that it's just one company doing this under their own materials. But what the EU should do, and really companies as well, work together on how do we create an industrial symbiosis around this concept of extractive waste, right? Of course, at the forefront of all of this should be how do we then communicate this with the local communities, and also how do we gain consent to do this, because it's not just about an exciting new technology possibility, but it actually does require, in many cases, of course, reminding the old tailings, historical tailings even, or some industries that have gone bankrupt, for example. And these, of course, have been polluting environments and are close to local communities who might not necessarily want to see a new industrial project coming up along who could impact them, right? So this is the thing, that gaining local community consent never disappears under this concept. But what I was saying is that we need to do more than what we're doing at the moment. And I think the projection at the moment is really exciting for the mining industry, of course. But the projection is very much mine first, ask questions later. And then the issue then becomes is, do we know enough of the materials that we actually have on hand that could be extracted, but are, of course, difficult because companies are not sharing that information, governments are not really requiring the companies to share that information, and then so we miss the opportunity to not only reduce our environmental impacts, but also increase circularity within the EU, as well as gaining business opportunities under this concept of extractive mining waste.
Well, thank you. This idea of getting industry buy-in, I mean, we're talking there specifically about mining on a specific company in one case. It is important. Madalena, I know with all sorts of Commission proposals, you go through a long consultative period. Tell us a bit about what you were hearing from stakeholders in the build-up to the CRMA.
Yes, so we've been discussing with the stakeholders, but a lot over the last the weeks, but also before that, because the Act has been prepared over the last few years. So we didn't start it only last year when it was announced, but the basis for preparing the Act has started some years ago. I remind of the Raw Materials Initiative, which was adopted in 2008 and then updated in 2011 when we started the first criticality assessment. This is an exercise that the Commission is doing, an assessment that we've been doing every 3 years in order to identify the materials that are critical for the European economy. And in determining what materials are included on this list, we take into consideration the economic importance and then the supply risks. So the Act comes, of course, together with a new criticality list, which was anyways up to be presented in 2023. But besides that, we also identify in the Act strategic raw materials, and this is a subgroup of the critical raw materials, and basically we focus on those materials that are essential for the clean technologies needed for the green digital transition, for defense and aerospace applications. So we look so first of all, what are the materials key for these strategic technologies, but also how the demand for these materials will increase in the future, and how also the supply will evolve. So basically, we have this twofold scope for the Act. So I was saying, and then we had because I'm coming back to how we and the discussion with the stakeholders. Then we had in 2020 an action plan which put forward certain actions that we still continue implementing. So basically throughout this time, and then ended up with last year when we actually got the mandate from the leaders, from the heads of states and from our president to move ahead and prepare a critical raw materials act. We've been discussing with the industry, with the civil society, with the member states, in order to put together the views and ideas and suggestions. We had an open consultation where we received over 700 opinions. So all these came together in the act that we put forward. After the act was adopted, we also received a lot of input, again, which for us it's quite positive, because the stakeholders are telling us that what we put forward is actually, it was very much needed, and it's a very good step forward. Of course, there are different opinions, and stakeholders can have their own views about what is good and what needs to be still improved. But that's why we have now discussions with the European Parliament, with the Council, the co-legislator that will finally decide on the act. So to conclude, the act was received very well by the community, and we are happy to see that. But as I said, we built this, and this final result has been actually the work done over the last few years.
Well, let's talk to one of the co-legislators. Henrike, I was going to ask you about what you think is going to be the direction of travel of the Act through the Parliament, and obviously we're a little getting ahead of ourselves. We won't talk about trilogue negotiations just yet. But I also will bring in a question already from Anders Hove, who said that Henrike had mentioned the need for more attention on demand-side measures, but heard about recycling being mentioned, the circular economy being mentioned. He's asking what other active proposals on the demand side might be worth highlighting.
Well, of course, we know that we have in the future growing demand of raw materials because we want to implement the Green Deal, means like on green technology, but also in the defense and space sector, which is something that is very critical and sensitive at the moment, since we have the war in Europe, of course. And we as parliamentarians also have the task that this is discussed openly, more openly, and not as a taboo, right? Because this is something we really have to answer to. But I think this is something what we currently do, working on the Critical Raw Materials Act, and really implement all these measures that we need. First of all, we need a push of industrial policy, European industrial policy. We have to make sure that the industry is competitive, and the small and medium enterprises as well, of course, the startups too. And what they need is raw materials at a reasonable price and with reliable value chains, of course. And this to ensure, and at the same time, not to be independent, not to be dependent on sources from other countries, is a goal that is very important. And at the other hand, of course, we have to ensure that with the highest ecological and social standards, and means like what we just discussed before, an acceleration of the procedures, of the permitting procedures for of course, is something we have to support, but only if it's not at costs of ecological and social standards. And this is something we really have to work on, be more realistic about the future demand. Of course, we somehow, when we try to regulate that, on the other hand, we really have to work together with the industry, and they know their calculations, what they need in the future, much better than governmental actors, of course. So we have some suggestion in the Critical Raw Materials Act, to ensure better dialogue on that. It was mentioned before, that aspect of an alliance. I think that's very important in the future, that we have an alliance between the industry and the governmental actors, as well as the local communities and the trade unions and all the people concerned by that, because we also know sustainable mining itself doesn't exist, right? I mean, we can work in that direction, and some actors do that pretty well, some others don't, but we have to ensure that we do our best here in Europe to support a green industry and also a green critical raw material strategy, and I hope that we will get to good results on that.
Well, thank you. Ansgar, let me come to you and get you to react to some of what you've heard so far, in particular the question around sustainable mining.
Yeah, I think first of all, it should be mentioned that taking into account all the different demand calculations that have been published and available, we can assume that there will be definitely an increase in demand, and all this demand is most likely not to be fulfilled by recycling, especially when it comes to certain minerals. So we have to talk about mining, and we have to talk about what we call sustainable mining as well. And it's not only Komatsu, but I think the whole industry here is prepared to support this. There are different technologies available. It's not only about electrification, but it is also about the efficiency in mining, the efficiency in the total operation when you run a mine, and also then basically the carbon footprint and the social impact also, which is quite important, especially when we are talking about projects in non-EU countries. It should be mentioned that if we enter these markets as let's say, as a European-based company, that we already do have certain standards that are, in most cases, higher than the local ones. On the other hand, we need to be also very pragmatic in approaching this by providing these countries, these mine sites with the latest technology. We already provide them with a technical standard that is usually very much not only state of the art, but in some areas ahead of the local standards. And this provides different challenges, but also opportunities. The opportunity certainly is for the mine sites to run the operations with very little impact on the environment and on the people living there. On the other side, it also offers tremendous opportunities for these people when it comes not only to jobs, but also when it comes to education. So all these aspects have to be taken into account when we are talking about sustainable mining. It's not only focusing on the technology, on the refining, which should, by the way, also be considered to be done locally, but also the environmental impact and the let's say ESG impact on ESG criteria for the local communities there.
Thank you. I mean, you're talking local communities. Let's zoom out quite a bit. Georg, and indeed some of the other panelists will be asked this as well. We've got a few questions coming in, including from Ian Kerr, on the so-called Critical Raw Materials Club, the idea of getting together with like-minded countries. And it's a complex geopolitical context we're currently in. What might that look like? What might it be most usefully doing? We don't have full details in the CRMA. So Georg, what would your perspective be?
I think obviously the international dimension here is essential. I'm saying, I mean, the Critical Raw Materials Act it's a super step forward. We needed it. We need to see the opportunity in it. Ansgar has spoken about the opportunity also for machinery industry in Europe, which is world leading, and so indeed there's a lot of opportunity we need to seek to develop. There's a big element of this which is about pushing for more mining, more refining in Europe, and we need to do that. I mean, the example I often take is the example of cobalt. One doesn't speak that much of it. We use it a lot. It's being mined today by the small hands of children in Congo. So it's clear that we also have responsibility of trying to do our own in terms of the effort of doing things more sustainability. But this being said, we shouldn't live under the illusion that in any way, and of course the percentage figures, the objectives that are put together in the Act do not suggest that at all, that we will be anywhere close to some form of sufficiency, self-sufficiency in Europe when one sees the minerals needs that will accompany the green transition, not least, but also in other strategic areas. So international partnerships, open trade, open supply chains will remain absolutely essential for Europe. And there I think we have to be very mindful and attentive to one thing, and that is, okay, a critical minerals club, we have to pursue it. But in a world that's all about economic security, even partners are allies. US, they want the access to these critical raw materials as well. When we say we do a partnership with Chile, we're very proud of the raw materials chapter in a free trade agreement with Chile. We also have to be mindful about the fact that a lot of those mines are actually Chinese owned already. So this is not at all going to be an easy international game for Europe. I think we have to play on all those different chapters, all those different levers that the Act is proposing. One is trying to do the right thing, but we also have to be very mindful that this is a very precarious environment. It's going to be a very precarious transition.
Madalena, I'd like to get your responses and your thoughts on this critical raw materials members club, as it were. I mean, what are the criteria for members? I know the ball has been started rolling, but there seems to be a lot of fine print that's still missing.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Happy that you actually given me the floor to talk about it. Actually, the club, as it was announced in the communication that accompanies the regulation, is still under consideration, being under consideration internally. So I cannot give you that many details, but what we can say is that the club aims to bring together consumer and resource-rich countries in order to establish a framework for discussion and cooperation, but also to foster investments in the producing countries and to help in developing a local value chain and bringing local value added. The Commission will start discussing with countries that would like to partner in establishing this club. And what I would like to underline is that the club will not replace or substitute, but will, on the contrary, will build on the existing multilateral and bilateral initiatives that exist already, because the EU remains deeply committed to continue working in the multilateral initiative that exists already. Another element that we can think of about the club is the set of principles that will be put forward for the partners to adhere to, and that would relate to market monitoring, to environmental, social, and governance standards, to preparedness in case of crisis, investment, how to stimulate and foster investment, a better regulatory environment. Work together on research and innovation, and enhanced exploration efforts. But I would like to, so that's basically the general idea. And as I said, the fine details are still under consideration internally. But I would like to pick up on what Georg mentioned earlier, the strategic partnerships, because that's what we have been already working on for the last few years. We have already 4 strategic partnerships that have been signed. We signed in 2021 a strategic partnership on raw materials value chain with Canada. The same in 2021, we signed a partnership with Ukraine. And last year, we signed a partnership with Kazakhstan and Namibia. So these are partnerships that look at the entire raw materials value chain, and that contains a line of action that go from business opportunities, so fostering business opportunities for both partners, cooperation and collaboration on research and innovation, collaboration on environment, social, and governance standards. And for the emerging economies, we have extra lines of actions, for example, support for building infrastructure, and that we do using the Global Gateway framework and facility, working together on developing skills and providing technical assistance. So there is a lot of action and work already ongoing in order to cooperate with partner countries that are delivering results. We are discussing and close to sign partnerships with Greenland and Norway, and so we have exploratory and technical discussions in view of partnership with these countries. We've been working and will continue working intensely on this because, as Greg already mentioned, it's very important that we work together with third countries and we develop partnerships that are beneficial for the EU, but also that will bring win-win benefits for the countries themselves to develop local value chains.
Well, you mentioned investment. There's a lot of questions coming in on that, but we'll come back to that in just a moment, because Henrika, I'd be interested to get your view as well on this idea of a club. Where might that fit in the future? Well, we've got free trade agreements in place. Does that mean expanding them? How might in your view, work? How should that work?
Well, I work at the European level as the Commission as well. So, of course, we have rather in perspective the European and international coordination on that, because that is very important. It's not rather a limiting national member state perspective, it's rather open to cooperation. And if you think, for example, on the IRA, so my personal wish would have been that before the IRA, we would have agreed on a transatlantic climate alliance, right? Because this would have been other consequences for the rest of the decision affecting European and American industry. And so if we work on that, you know, to have an understanding where we want to go to in the future on political issues as well, like protecting the climate and the environment, we can be much more powerful with our decisions together. I mean, when we were just discussing today the amendments, we were also thinking about the relevant argument, you know, what about stockpiling, for example? Would it make sense to cooperate in that regard on strategic projects? So these are kind of issues you could work much better together, as we in general do in Europe, but also if we broaden our perspective. And I think we know, of course, international cooperation can contribute to the effective implementation of the legislation we have on the table at the moment in the European Union with the CRMA, like when we talk about information sharing and data exchange. So international cooperation allows for the sharing of information and data related to critical raw materials. And this includes, of course, geological surveys, exploration findings, production statistics, and supply chain information. And collaborative efforts in data exchange can enhance transparency, improve market understanding, and support evidence-based decision-making. And by sharing knowledge and expertise, countries can collectively assess their raw material needs, identify potential risks, and develop appropriate strategies. And that is useful for all of us. And as a second point, of course, international cooperation is very good for the aspects of resource diversification and supply chain resilience, because international partnerships can promote resource diversification by identifying and accessing alternative sources of critical raw materials. By collaborating with other countries, regions, or organizations, countries can reduce their reliance on a limited number of suppliers and mitigate the risks associated with supply chain disruptions. And coordinated efforts can help to establish a more resilient and diversified supply chain, ensuring a stable and sustainable supply of raw materials. And of course, we know that it would be an advantage to cooperate on research and development collaboration. International cooperation can facilitate joint research and development initiatives focused on critical raw materials. Collaborative research efforts can explore innovative technologies, extraction methods, recycling techniques, and substitution options. And by pooling resources, expertise, and funding, countries can accelerate technological advancements and promote knowledge transfer and drive sustainable solutions for raw material challenges. And as an additional point, it would be, of course, great to work together on the harmonization of standards and regulations. And international cooperation can support the harmonization of standards and regulations related to critical raw materials. Consistent regulations and standards across countries can promote responsible sourcing, ethical practices, and environmental sustainability. And by aligning policies, countries can prevent the relocation of environmental damaging practices to regions with weaker regulations. And because we don't have the same situations in all countries, of course, and this harmonization facilitates the development of a level playing field, promoting fair trade and reducing market distortions, the aspect you were just mentioning before. And as a last point, I would like to mention capacity building and knowledge exchange, and also multilateral platforms and frameworks that would be a real advantage for all of us to cooperate on critical raw materials together.
Well, let me pick out just one of the many points you raised there on standards. Ansgar, I'd be very keen to get your view on what are the benefits from an industry perspective, or what are the challenges?
I think listening to this, I think it's important to mention again, I think it was Georg who just raised it, Europe is quite late in entering this game in a, let's say, consolidated, concentrated way. And other countries are already there. China has been mentioned several times, but also our partners, such as the US, have their own interest and playing their own game, so to say, in this respect. So when it comes into standardization, it should be mentioned that, or considered at least, that the countries or the regions, they do have their own interest. And so standardization cooperation is good, is needed also, because none of the companies or the countries can shoulder the efforts that are needed by themselves. But I'm a little bit afraid that if we want to achieve this target of this minimum supplies of the several commodities by 2013, and if we focus now on standardization and getting the right fundament, Europe may lose some time. There are other countries that are quicker, more decisive, and how to say, more forced into the markets, and they already made their claims. And so probably we should focus on several activities at the same time. Europe has to do something to invest in non-EU operations, to be honest, to make sure that these targets are achievable. We can try, and of course it would be helpful and welcomed also from the industry if there are standards, technical, ethical, or whatever regulatory standpoints that are on the same level, because this makes it easier to accommodate them. But waiting for them may take too long, and would then significantly increase the lead time until we see any benefits from the various activities and initiatives here. So looking from a, let's say, industry perspective a little bit, I think we should start getting our feet on the ground, so to say, because as I said earlier, exporting, let's say, European or Western technology usually puts quite a positive impact in these countries. We should not underestimate this effect. And this already gives a good starting base. And one other point is also important to mention: when we are talking about mining, we should not only consider about mining. And the question really is, because there are not that many greenfield operations or projects.
Sorry, I think you cut off just there at the very end of your comments, but we caught most of it. Diego, let me turn back to you. No problem. I think everything was clear. It was just the last word or two. Diego, let me come back to you. Feel free to react. A lot has been said, but also let me take a general question from our audience, just to you, on your view on the issues of social acceptance regarding industrial extraction and processing projects that will have to be set up in EU territories. What, in your view, should we expect from member states, from regional, from EU level, and indeed from companies?
Yes, so this question is a very good one, very timely as well. I think a lot of the discussions at the moment, one, they're extremely favorable to the mining industry. I mean, just the whole language on increasing public acceptance, or actually facilitating public acceptance, should really raise red flags for anyone who cares about human rights or environmental due diligence. Reason being is because, I mean, let's take an example of what's happening in the global south. I'm from Peru, so I know the situation there very well. This term of increasing public acceptance has been tried, actually. The mine in Yanacocha in the early 2010s, trying to extract copper from Cajamarca in northern Peru. The expansion of that was the Conga mine. And this talk about facilitating public acceptance was very well used. And what happened is the government actually sent the police and military as well to squash the dissent, right? The protests that were happening, because this project was really threatening the livelihoods of the local communities, particularly the water. So when we talk about facilitating public acceptance, a lot of the concern around this is like, oh, you know, local communities are against these mining projects. One is a very, very condescending type of way of looking at it, because a lot of the burden of proof, in a sense, is put on the communities. Like, you know, a lot of the responsibility as well as put on the communities on they should change their mind. This project is good, so these are just people that are like not knowledgeable or what have you. So it's extremely condescending, and it really erases the real and legitimate concerns that these communities have. Just to give you an idea, in Barroso, for example, in northern Portugal, I mean, we talk about how the EU has these laws and they're better than the rest of the global south. But let me just give you an example. So in northern Portugal, in Barroso, a lithium mine is by Savannah Resources is trying to take off there. And in the second EIA, because there were some issues with the first EIA, and the local communities and NGOs were also pushing for the government to take a second look, a look at their EIA process. And within the second EIA, the local communities reported that they had 10 days to look into the public participation. We're talking about thousands of documents, right? So this is in Europe currently happening. So what will happen with strategic projects coming in the global south when there is a lack of oversight, at least from a European level? In these countries who are in some areas are heavily indebted, of course, but aside from that, a lot of these countries do unfortunately have issues with governance, right? So what I'm saying is, without proper due diligence and relying solely on certifications, this is going to have really serious ramifications on human rights aspects. And maybe one more thing, last thing I will say, when we talk about strategic projects, it's good to get the consent from the country. I mean, that's good that the wording on explicit consent for third countries is there. I mean, honestly, you had to have it. you couldn't not think of it. But the issue about that is that, like I mentioned earlier, 54% of these projects around the world, energy transition minerals, are happening in near or within indigenous lands and land-connected peoples, right? So then what you have an issue is that if a country, let's say Indonesia or let's say Brazil, now the Lua is there, it might be a little bit different, but let's say Brazil or let's say Peru even, a lot of lithium has recently been found there. So the concern is then that you have the state agrees to it, but then the local communities, particularly those local indigenous populations, might not necessarily give the consent. So then you have a institutional push to get this project going. And guess who's going to do that? The military. And this is something that is really not being talked about, is how the nexus between military, security, surveillance mechanisms will be used and could be used to local communities on the ground. And without proper environmental and human rights due diligence, these issues could increase. So anyway, this is really something that we need to look into.
That's a very strong message, Diego, and quite alarming to hear in terms of military use. To come back to Europe, where I hope we're not actually talking in those terms, let me turn to you, Georg. A question coming from Florian Schuck online is actually somewhat related. It's how do you judge the chances of national and local authorities to implement the faster permitting processes mentioned in the CRMA? Does the EU even have the competencies to prescribe this? How do we do this in a way that is taking into account some of the concerns that Diego has raised?
I think that you're pointing the finger at one of the fundamental difficulties here, and that is we know that we need these minerals. We know that we want more of them from Europe, also in part to address the kind of concerns that Diego is pointing to, that we want this to happen in ways that are more sustainable and more compatible with our values. At the same time, are we really ready for the trade-offs that come with that? Are we ready in terms of acceptance in local communities in Europe? And I think this whole space of economic industrial policy these days is marred by these trade-offs between economic efficiency, economic security, climate ambitions, sustainability and environmental acceptability and social acceptabilities. And this is extremely difficult to navigate. And to answer frankly, I don't think it is an act from Brussels that will solve the debates at local level. What I think it is important in an act from Brussels is that it's a solid act. It's something that's been thought through, and it's driving these debates now. But these debates need to happen at local level. And I think so across everything that we have discussed today, we should be very, very careful with too much wishful thinking, and we have to sort of stick to a high degree of realism. So coming back to the sort of the international dimension, and I think it was Henrique that mentioned the US and the IRA. I mean, the US is not in a cooperative approach so far when it comes to raw materials and what we've seen in the IRA. We have the TTC in a couple of days. Well, I think it's a fundamental test what the meeting that's going to take place in Stockholm. Are we going to see US buy-in into the club idea with all the good things that are the good intentions that have been announced? Are we going to see proposals for a partnership between the EU and the US on stockpiling? So all these are difficult questions, whether it's the very local questions when it comes to developing mining and our own ecosystems for mining in Europe, or the international dimension. But the needs, the demand is going to be there, and there's definitely these are complex issues that we really need to spend time and trying to work through, and that's the only answer I can say at the local level too. Of course, in other areas and other debates about wind farms, for instance, there's this discussion about having go-to places, but whether this all can happen with the speed and agility that is required today, and that the Raw Materials Act proposals in terms of permitting, one is indeed permitted to have some doubts. Yes.
Well, to take one of your points, Georg, I think we could talk for hours about the scope or otherwise of the Trade and Technology Council. That's something we'll possibly have to park for another day's discussion. It's so vast. But a follow-up question for you, Nicholas Wright has just asked, how realistic is it how realistic is the CRMA in terms of achieving what it's seeking to achieve in the time frame set out? Just your quick view as a neutral analyst.
Well, I think first of all, there were expectations ahead of the CRMA AM that it would set more ambitious objectives. So I think the Commission, but of course it's for Madalena to say something about that, but has tried sort of to moderate the what could have been wishful thinking. There is a degree of realism that has infused into this already. I think. Will we reach the targets that have been set? I allow myself to be doubtful. I think we have to give it a try. There is a clear issues in terms of clearly accepting or convincing the European public, but I think also we are facing major financing issues for all this. Of course, there are big mining companies that don't necessarily need capital and financing to start up projects, but they will not necessarily go to Europe, where it might be more expensive to extract and refine. So if we are to develop local European actors, I asked the question, where are the integrators? We have the technology, the machinery that has been highlighted, but where are the integrators? And where is the sort of the financing environment for this in Europe? I'm not sure we have it.
Thank you. We do have, as I said, quite a few questions, a little bit around the financing. Madalena, I want to come back to you with a kind of an overarching question in terms of where the benefits might be. Stefan Sagrabo is asking, what is the added benefit of picking certain projects and giving them the strategic status and certain benefits instead of giving the same benefits to all in terms of support? Is there a risk that this will add administrative burden, or will it only benefit the largest projects? Before we get into more details on sort of procurement and investment, give us your thoughts on that.
Yes, so indeed, in in Norway, as I said at the beginning, the major aim of the Act is to strengthen and to foster and to ramp up the European value chain, the raw materials value chain. And in order to do this, we propose to select strategic projects that will be projects along the value chain. So we are going to look at projects in exploitation, in processing, refining, and recycling. The projects. In order to become a strategic project, of course, you need to fulfill certain criteria, which are clearly presented in the Act. So once a project is labeled strategic project, has two main benefits. The first one is a streamline and faster permitting process, and the Act proposes certain deadlines by which the national authorities need to deliver the permits needed for the project to start being implemented. And the second major element is access to finance. It's true that, and well, you mentioned already that we'll come back to this discussion, the Act doesn't come with new money, but the Act, what is proposed is to help the project promoters that will be identified as having a strategic project to find the best financial instrument and program that can support that particular project. The Act proposes the establishment of a board, so there will be a governance system for the Act, and the board, which will be comprised of member states, the European Commission, and the observers from the European Parliament, will actually contain a subgroup that will discuss the strategic project per se, and they will also look into finding the best financing solution for this project. We are looking at existing financial instruments at the EU level, at the national level, but the most important is our wish that we encourage a blending system where the public funds will help attracting private investments. So that would be the system that we have in mind. We are, of course, in discussions with the financial institutions, with the national and promotional banks, in order to see how they can, everybody can join in this process, and together we find ways to finance the projects that will be considered as a strategic project for the EU.
Thank you for that. It's come up, several people obviously asking about questions of how funding can take place, what sort of subsidies, investments and so on are going to be there to assist those companies that are trying to achieve the aims of the CRMA. But let me come to you, Ansgar. In a more general sense, Katarina Petaj-Kontic is saying we surely need to do more on the research side regarding sustainable mining, regarding recycling, regarding new technologies. What sort of incentives or support is already available in this area? What do you, from the industry side, see as being the loopholes or the gaps in how those sorts of research requirements are funded?
Actually, there are not that many fundings available for the research work that's definitely necessary. But there's quite a lot ongoing. Let me just explain a little bit around this. It's not just the electrification issue, which is certainly number one priority right now, but it is especially everything around smart mining. And this comprises the whole mining setup, but also remote control or assist control of the different applications and machines you have running in a mine. So all these requires a lot of research work, requires a lot of R&D work to be done. And this is currently not so much supported, but could be one of the means to enable this. It's also maybe in this context worthwhile to be mentioned that there are still a lot of university and institutes available in Europe that could do research work, that could do supportive activities here. When it comes to the governmental side, maybe one example is helpful. In Canada, there are a lot of programs running for the mine sites to reduce the carbon footprint, to increase efficiency, and to reduce the let's say, overall ecological impact of the mine operations to the environment, to the local community. And these subsidies, these support financial fundings there that's available, helped a lot for several mines there to accomplish their project on electrification, thus reducing their carbon footprint by 50-60%. So there are some subsidies available, but here in Europe, to my knowledge, not that many, to be honest.
Just as a follow-up then regarding the sorts of technologies that you're using at Komatsu Germany, do you have any particular partnerships or interactions that are good examples that you could give to point to as best practice, for example?
Yeah, we do cooperate on certain topics, technical topics, development topics, of course, with universities here in Germany, whether it is the university in Aachen or Bochum, really on a case-by-case situation. But especially when it comes to digitalization of mining, there are a lot of development works ongoing, and here we rely and strongly cooperate with the institutes that are here in our area. In Germany mainly.
Thank you. Heinrich, let me come back to you. I know you're working on the Raw Materials Act, the strategy, and it's not really within your remit to be talking about how to go about putting funding instruments into place. But do you have a sense about what sort of overarching frameworks the EU needs to put in place to support the industry as well in delivering on these sustainability targets? And also, tell us a bit more about, you mentioned at the very outset, some of those benchmarks and targets that you think are most achievable.
Yes, of course, this is a topic, financing, that is relevant, of course, for us in the Parliament. And as we know, according to the impact assessment and based on Commission services, most exploration companies active in Europe are really based outside of the European Union. That's an interesting aspect to know. And most private and public financial institutions haven't been involved in financing exploration projects, and stated that this was due to the high risk involved. Nevertheless, financing of new mines is generally considered very risky, and the private financial sector is not necessarily willing to engage. However, they are willing to engage in processing and refining as well as recycling activities. So that's a very interesting aspect to know. And when I was talking to industrial actors, they also told me that being recognized as a strategic project helps a lot when they apply for financial assistance. So of course, we have to consider all the details when we negotiate in the future weeks the Critical Raw Materials Act. So first of all, how we define a strategic project. And I think, of course, to mention that again, because we didn't talk about it enough today, the environmental aspects are very, very important here. And I think strategic projects being recognized by banks as well can be possible if we really implement the highest ecological and social standards. Then it's possible, and then this will have consequences, of course. And I mean, it's on us as well to ensure that the green industry has the tools to work with, and we have to set incentives, and we have to encourage that everything goes together, the ecological, social aspects, the competition aspects, the financing aspects, and this is what we have to negotiate on in detail in the following weeks and months.
Diego, a question I think you might be interested in answering about practical responsibilities when it comes to procurement and purchasing of raw materials. Who should be responsible for what? What should be the role of procurement departments in, for example, entities such as automotive manufacturers? Stephanie Wolf is asking just for thoughts on where that responsibility should lie.
So I don't work necessarily in procurement or the automotive sector myself, but ultimately it has to be on the company. The company has to make sure that it's doing its proper human rights and environmental due diligence, particularly, for example, in the case of certifications, which is very much talked about, there are serious issues with certifications as well. They're generally not very transparent. There's that issue of helping for the mining company, or sorry, not the mining company, but the industry, because they are generally an industry mechanism, right? There are some more interesting than others. For example, the CRMA, that one is obviously more robust, and it has specifically within it the consent, community consent. So they have a free, prior, and informed consent within it. This is useful, and I think companies should really look into how their supply chains are going to be impacted. Of course, they should know that. But I think at the end of the day, they need to follow the United Nations guiding principles, the OECD guidelines. They have specific measures on how companies should assess these human rights, environmental due diligence. Now with the CSDDD inquiring much even more ambitions there, this is where really the company has to behave as best as it can. And this is also even more so. Not only is strong due diligence measures from a company good for the business itself, but also it can help in a reliance of the supply itself, right? So if you behave accordingly and you're following the rule book, then you're much better able to assess how your shortcomings will be in the supply chain or the value chain in general. And then also it will be better also for community relations, right? Aside from that, going further downstream, having a strong due diligence, following strong due diligence measures really allows for other companies to also trust your company as well. So right now with the CSDDD, we'll see how the negotiations end. Of course, a lot is still to be determined. But at the end of the day, companies are going to have to behave better, 100%. There is much more community knowledge about how companies are operating. Of course, there's potentially going to be much more resistance as well to many of these projects. And at the end of the day, if we're going to have an effective supply chain, then this will really rely on how good these companies are able to follow the law. And also how not only following the law, but also how the states, because a lot of it is also on the states. So you mentioned who's really responsible. One, of course, the company, because that is their business, but also the state. So the state itself has to make sure that the companies behave accordingly. And if there's any wrongdoing, that it can really take action, right? The implementation of laws is also a really critical thing. One thing is having good laws. In Europe, for example, we have very good laws, but we have very serious issues with their implementation, right? So I think this is really important for states. If you want to create a stronger supply chain, one, make sure your companies are behaving accordingly, and two, make sure that you have the systems in place so that the implementation of your laws are actually respected. Otherwise, we will have much more issues, not only on the ground, but also generally speaking. Consumers are also asking for much more human rights and environmental due diligence, and are even willing to pay for it. I think it's even on the consumer side. It's also people want to make sure that companies are behaving accordingly.
Thank you. I say in all sectors, Diego, if there were no bad actors, we wouldn't need laws. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, so we do need them. Georg, a question has come in from Alfonso Medellina I guess for you, but it's a complicated question, I think, on the question of extractive partnerships and how companies should assess them. So the regulation mentions assisting partner countries in developing their own processing capacities. How does that sit with the target of 40% for EU processing capacity? Which comes first? Is it a balancing act? How do we think about that?
Well, I would think about it in this way, but of course in the following way. But of course, the other panelists might have other views on this and come in. But I don't think we should think of it as either or sort of either we do something domestically or we try for international solutions. I think we're going to have. Even though as I said, I don't think sort of the 10% reduced dependency is super ambitious, but I think we are going to have difficulties developing everything we're saying we want to do. So we have to bet on several horses at the same time. So it's not. I don't see the risk sort of efforts going in the international direction. Working on the club, working on the international partnership is something that's going to crowd out domestic efforts, trying to get a mining and refining industry up on its feet, or scaling that in Europe. I think that the challenges are going to come on both fronts, and we will really need both. So I don't know if that's a partial answer to the question.
Well, spread betting is definitely a thing that some people stand behind. As you say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, perhaps is another way of looking at it. I'm conscious that we're into the last 15 minutes, and I want to try and get through a couple of quick questions, Madalena, to you before I come to a wrap-up and to all of you in terms of time frame and what comes next. Igor Lefebvre has asked, how often is the list of critical raw materials reviewed? For example, copper is listed as strategic, but that might pose an issue in case of supply chain disruption for the energy sector. And also another question, Madalena, for you from Charles Lowe on financing, wondering why the Commission chose not to make a reference to insurance in the proposed text. I know if you can quickly tackle both of those, that would be great.
Yes, so when it comes to the list that we proposed, the tool is the criticality, the critical raw materials and the strategic raw materials. So what we propose is that they will be reviewed every 4 years, and this is with having in mind the need to ensure stability, to ensure a stable environment for investment, because the investors also need stability when it comes to the materials that are on the list. That's what we proposed. The criticality assessment has been done so far every 3 years, and with every 3 years the number of materials on the list have increased. So, well, yeah, as I said, the Act proposes to be reviewed every 4 years after the entry into force. I have to say on the second question, I don't really understand. So you mean insurance when it comes to the financing of the projects, or I'm sorry, but
yeah,
I think I understand.
I think it's regarding the question of risk transfer and taking risks in terms of changing processes.
So yeah, on that, well, that's what we aim with the financial system that we want. So the blending, the system that we want is basically to de-risk the project. So the public finance that will be used to support a special strategy project will give a signal to the market that the project is important and that the public authorities are supporting it. So by this we de-risk. We also have support, for example, under InvestEU. The EU has signed guarantee agreements with European Investment Bank, for example. So if funds are used from InvestEU, the EU takes part of the risk using by this guarantee agreement. So there are instruments that can be used to basically de-risk the project.
Well, thank you very much for taking those questions. As you say, some a little bit nuanced. Heinrich, let me come to you to get your closing thoughts. I have a question. Antonio Knoll is asking, what's the timeline for the Critical Raw Materials Act in Parliament? Are there any changes in the schedule? When will the report be presented? And I'd like to know from you, from your perspective, what needs to happen in the further political process to make it a success?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Of course, we know already that the time plan is very ambitious with the Critical Raw Materials Act. We had a comparable ambition with the CHIPS Act before, and we were hurrying up. I was working on the CHIPS Act as well, and we were very speedy. But in this point, we will see what's taking place. I mean, we have to find a line in a way that a democratic process is fulfilled, and at the same time that we're listening enough to all the stakeholders concerned by that act. And I think a very crucial point will be here, of course, the environmental protection. I think it's very clear that we now need a green European raw material strategy and industrial policy that focuses on a competitive climate neutral economy by 2050. But it has to be very clear as well that a blind call for more mining is out of place. Mining in European protected areas such as Natura 2000 areas must remain a taboo. And it might be the case that, of course, course, this will cause lots of discussions, right? Because it's a very big issue in the core of the Green Deal, and it might delay as well the process. Let's see what happens. But in general, I would say that all of the stakeholders are, of course, interested in hurrying up because we want to be competitive. We need raw materials and quick decisions because the permitting requirements you were just mentioning, the environmental, social aspects, and we all know that it's in the core of a functioning industry means that we really have to be very precise and quick as possible. So let's see what happens. But it's I might be the case that we get it done till the end of the year, and let's stay in contact and discuss that in the future. We will see.
Well, that's ambitious, but absolutely. We'll be back in touch in a few months to see how we're getting on. Diego, let me turn to you. I'm conscious that we didn't delve particularly into recycling, so I'm going to throw a couple of questions regarding recycling at you before getting your final thought. Marcela Mantilla is asking, what do we need? Do we need more industrial know-how to ensure better sorting and identification of waste streams? Nok Yong Kang is asking, do we need some sort of EU export ban on certain waste that includes strategic raw materials? If you can give us your thoughts on that, as well as sort of summing up about what needs to happen, in your view, to make the CRMA a success.
Yes, no, thank you for that. See, the question on recycling, and I mentioned it earlier, is there's a lot of focus at the moment within the Critical Raw Materials Act on the lowest angle of the circular economy, if you will. We need to move higher up into the waste hierarchy framework. We need to pay much more attention on not only on recycling items. I mean, this is absolutely necessary, of course, but really how we can repair items. And I think here the ESPR can really play a role, right, with how many products we're able to repair in the coming years. Aside from that, the inclusion of recycled content targets, as we have in the batteries regulation, that is really important, and we need to move towards other products to include recycled content, right? Because we really need to mobilize the sector in that area. On another hand, financing is absolutely needed. Of course, the talent that is required to recycle these materials is absolutely needed. So I'm glad to see that there is a focus also on the financing of education. Aside from that, as the colleague mentioned in this question regarding designating some streams as waste, I mean, black mass, indeed, a lot of this is leaving the EU, as of course putting this as a hazard waste would keep it here in the EU, of course, with potential for recycling. So a lot of things are needed. Maybe one last point that I could make on how to increase resilience. Well, we know that repairability, for example, there's a lack of a just transition within the Critical Raw Materials Act. And I think including reuse targets could really help to create not only a recycling industrial symbiosis in that sense, where waste streams become recycled goods, but also how we can include jobs for people within the repair and reuse community, right? We know that these jobs really do help a lot of impoverished communities as well as the elderly. So I think we need to really talk about much more on how we can use reuse targets within the Critical Raw Materials Act. It's a regulation at the end of the day, and it's really sad to see that all of the focus is on recycled and not higher up the waste stream.
Well, thank you very much. Ansgar, I know as well you're a downstream user of raw materials, but from your view, encompassing everything you've heard so far, what do you think needs to happen to make the CRMA a success?
First of all, I think it still should be mentioned that simply the fact that mining is now on the agenda is a key factor for me, and is a key enabler actually also for the EU really to cope with the challenges of the near future when it comes to decarbonization and digitalization. We all know that the modern devices, whether it's the laptop, the handy, or the mobile phone or whatsoever, they all require all these critical raw materials. So from this perspective, I think, once again, this is quite an important step. I think we discussed now today several aspects, but really looking also at the time frame that we set ourselves with 2030 and the activities so far, and also in acknowledgement where other economic regions like China and the US are. I think we really need to define very quickly a set of different activities to start investing and to start having a more closer look in the various corporations and activities that are needed to succeed in this. Again, there are just 7 years left. This is not much. The EU operations will probably not provide the expected results. So we need to look into international corporations. We need to buy into these grounds, and this is where focus should be given. And then financing of these activities and the backup by the EU and by the national governments. This will be definitely a key factor for success.
Thank you. Well, Madalena, a final word from you on the timeline and what might make it a success from your perspective. I guess your heavy lifting is done already.
Yes, actually, we are very much engaged now with in the discussions with the co-legislators. So basically, we are in the hands of the co-legislators. We are happy to explain our proposal and to provide evidence for what we put in. So of course, it's as I said, it's up to the European Parliament and the Council to take it forward. We stand ready to continue the discussions with them. And I pick up on what Ansgar has just mentioned. So his last sentence, that indeed there is the need of a commitment of all the stakeholders, the member states, the industry, the civil society, in order for this to succeed. And we need to be fast because the time is running out, and the 2030 is very close, and we need so much to implement before we get there and before we actually have concrete results on the ground and the benchmarks are fulfilled.
Thank you very much, Madalena. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. I know when you've just put out an act from the Commission within recent months, you get a lot of complicated questions, so we appreciate your time. Georg, I'm passing the somewhat poisoned chalice of speaking last to you. Your final thoughts, what do we need to see happen? Sum up for us what you think you're taking away from the last hour or so's discussion.
Well, I don't know if it's a poisoned chalice, but I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. And just to pick up a couple of points. Well, what Diego said about circularity obviously is massively important. And I think far too little of our electronics is being recycled, and this can be a source for a lot, but it's just not happening. If you take big European countries, Germany, for instance, this producer responsibility and the investment into this is way too low. And of course, when you ask why, well, people say there's not a business case for it, and I'm wondering why. Sort of when the demand situation is going to be what it's going to be, but then that means that you need to look at different tools and instruments of supporting that. And I think part of it is probably support, financial support, but there are also different tools that were mentioned in the questions. I think we have to think out of the box and think out of sort of the past ways of or habits we've had in Europe, and we see that the Americans are taking certain types of measures in relation to trade, imports and exports, etc. That might be part of the solution. Procurement obviously is important too. We had Macron that said the other day in a different area, but relating to electric vehicles and batteries, and saying that public support to e-vehicles in France would be tied to batteries done in a certain way and coming from Europe. So I think there is still a debate that needs to mature there. But in terms of sort of my very last remark, I would say there's one word that hasn't been mentioned, but that was figuring quite prominently in the last State of the Union speech of von der Leyen. That was the sovereignty fund, and I think this is really a key question in all this. We've heard that there's no new money linked to the Critical Raw Materials Act, but we also know that there is a market failure out there, that investors are not willing to take the risk to invest in mining. So there is so we're pointing to blending solutions, public and private, etc. Again, I'm asking, do we have the financial infrastructure for that? Do we have is the EIB group, whether it's the investment fund or the bank side, scaled and ready for this? So I think really the sovereignty fund that we've been promised with the midterm review of the MFF is really has something to deliver in relation to all this. If we take our sovereignty and our reduced dependency seriously going ahead.
Thank you very much. I think you pointed to something that's been very clear, and that is that the Critical Raw Materials Act certainly does not stand alone. It comes alongside the CHIPS Act, the Green Deal, circular economy, even things like right to repair. So I know we are going to have many more conversations on that in the weeks and months to come. Thank you so much to you, our panelists, for your great insights and great discussion. Also, thank you to the audience for your very many questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them in the time allowed, but please feel free to continue the conversation online on social media of your choice using the hashtag EADebates, and do keep an eye on your Actives events page because we will be talking about this plenty more in the future. Have a great day.